We often mistakenly believe that stripping away a home can push a human being to the absolute edge of death, entirely unaware that the most impenetrable foundations of this world are not constructed from mortar and stone, but are meticulously forged from the deafening silence of enduring hands. It was a brutally cold morning in October. The biting wind swept fiercely through the rural town of Whistle Creek, Indiana, dragging dead maple leaves across the frozen pavement and dropping the morning chill to a bitter 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret Holloway stood perfectly still in the center of the living room she had meticulously maintained for 51 years. She was 76 years old. Her hands were heavily calloused, mapped with the pale scars of 1,000 sewing needles, burned by countless cast-iron skillets, and weathered by decades of silent, unwavering devotion to a family she thought she knew. She breathed in slowly. Across the antique coffee table, her son-in-law, Vincent Croft, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive wool suit. Vincent was 50 years old, a man whose polished exterior and perfectly styled hair could never quite mask the hollow, grasping greed that constantly darted behind his dark eyes. Beside him stood Evelyn, Margaret's own 48-year-old daughter. Evelyn kept her eyes glued to the oak floorboards, her manicured fingers nervously twisting the leather strap of a designer purse, utterly incapable of meeting the steady, calm gaze of the mother who had breathed life into her. They had come to take everything. "The sale closed this morning," Vincent stated coldly, his voice slicing through the quiet sanctity of the room like a jagged blade. He tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the table. It was a property transfer, bearing a signature that Vincent had masterfully forged 4 years ago, during the exact agonizing weeks when Margaret was drowning in the suffocating grief of burying her husband, Samuel. Vincent had waited patiently in the shadows, letting the dirt settle on Samuel's grave before quietly manipulating the paperwork, slowly bleeding her name off the deed and selling the sprawling 2-story house right from under her feet to a corporate developer. Margaret stared at the crisp white paper. She did not scream, she did not fall to her knees, beg for mercy, or shed a single melodramatic tear. Instead, a profound, stoic dignity settled over her fragile shoulders, pulling her spine perfectly straight. She had spent a lifetime holding the emotional weight of this entire family, absorbing their failures, their fears, and their selfish demands, and she absolutely refused to let them see her break now. "You have 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings," Vincent ordered sharply, tapping his expensive leather shoe against the floorboard Samuel had laid by hand. He handed her a flimsy brown paper bag. He told her she needed to find her own way down the highway to the county nursing home, a bleak and underfunded facility located 10 miles outside the town limits. Evelyn finally looked up, her face a pathetic mask of fake sympathy, but the absolute cowardice radiating from her posture told Margaret everything she needed to know about her daughter's silent complicity. The betrayal was absolute. Margaret took the paper bag without a single word. She walked quietly down the narrow hallway, her footsteps barely making a sound, and entered the master bedroom. She bypassed the heavy oak dressers, the expensive china, the silver tea sets, and decades of accumulated memories that bound her to this earth. She packed 3 pairs of warm socks, a single change of clothes, a small wooden comb, and her toothbrush. Nothing else mattered. When she returned to the living room, Vincent was already holding the front door wide open, letting the freezing October wind rush into the warmth of the house. Margaret stopped at the threshold.
She turned her head slowly, letting her steady, piercing eyes rest entirely on her daughter. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, pulling all the air out of the room until Evelyn visibly shrank back against the floral wallpaper. "Your father would be deeply ashamed of you," she said calmly. Her voice did not tremble. She stepped out onto the porch, walking down the long concrete driveway without looking back at the life she was leaving behind. She did not look at the rose bushes she had planted, nor the wooden porch swing Samuel had carved with his own 2 hands. She shoved her freezing fingers deep into the pockets of her worn wool coat. Inside the frayed lining, she felt the entirety of her remaining worldly wealth. She had exactly $11 in crumpled, faded bills. Beside the bills was a tarnished copper 5-cent coin. It was a sacred keepsake. Samuel had given her that specific coin on their very first date at a local diner in the bitter winter of 1968. Her entire net worth, the sum total of 51 years of relentless sacrifice and unconditional love, amounted to less than $12. The wind howled fiercely. Trudging down the familiar frost-covered streets of Whistle Creek with nothing but a crinkling paper bag and $11 to her name, Margaret became a ghost in her own town. She walked past the bakery, past the old hardware store, and past the towering oak trees, entirely unaware that a rusted padlock at a desolate auction lot on the outskirts of town was waiting to unleash a 10-year secret that would rewrite the very fabric of her existence.
The darkest hours of the night dragged on with agonizing slowness. Margaret sat completely motionless on a freezing stone bench outside the Whistle Creek Municipal Post Office. The temperature had plummeted to a brutal 26 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the moisture in the air into a thin, glittering layer of frost across the concrete sidewalks. The stone surface offered no comfort, aggressively draining her body heat by the second. But she sat with her back rigidly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her chin held high. Every passing hour felt like a physical blow. The town clock chimed at 2, then 3, then 4 in the morning, marking the agonizingly slow passage of time, while her legs ached with a deep, throbbing pain. The bitter wind chewed relentlessly at her exposed neck, tearing through the thin fabric of her clothes, but she absolutely refused to seek shelter in the doorways of the local businesses where people might see her broken state. She would not become a spectacle of pity for the townsfolk who had known her for half a century. She endured the night in absolute silence. When the pale, lifeless sun finally crept over the eastern horizon, it cast long, gray shadows across the empty town square. Margaret slowly stood up. Her joints cracked, stiff from hours of freezing immobility, but her posture remained impeccably straight. Her stomach was completely hollow, clawing with hunger, yet her mind was terrifyingly clear. A sharp metallic screech echoed from a quarter-mile down the road. Margaret turned her head. Down a gravel path, at the very edge of the town limits, sat a sprawling, dilapidated self-storage facility, bordered by a chain-link fence. The roofs were made of corrugated tin, heavily rusted and sagging under the weight of neglected years. A chaotic crowd of local junk dealers, pawn shop owners, and aggressive scavengers had gathered in the cold morning air, barking out bids and laughing loudly. It was a foreclosure auction, a ruthless feeding frenzy where scavengers bought abandoned units for pennies to strip them of anything remotely valuable. She walked toward the noise. Margaret stood quietly at the back of the loud, rowdy crowd. The men pushed and shoved each other out of the way, their eyes scanning the lots like starving wolves. They reeked of cheap, stale tobacco, unwashed clothes, and the raw, desperate greed of men looking to profit from someone else's absolute ruin.
The heavy-set auctioneer stood in front of a long row of units, holding a clipboard in one hand and a heavy pair of steel bolt cutters in the other. With a loud snap, he severed the rusted padlock off unit number 42, violently throwing the metal door upward with a deafening crash. A cloud of thick, suffocating dust billowed into the morning air. The crowd peered inside, shining cheap flashlights into the suffocating darkness of the 10 by 10 foot space. It was a bleak, impenetrable tomb of shadows. From the doorway, all anyone could see was a massive, chaotic mountain of filthy canvas tarps, splintered planks, cobwebs, and what appeared to be rusted, worthless scrap metal stacked haphazardly to the ceiling. "Looks like a pure garbage dump," one of the junk dealers spat in disgust. "I wouldn't take that unit if you paid me," another man yelled loudly, waving his hands in dismissal. The auctioneer sighed heavily, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He asked for $20. The crowd remained dead silent. He dropped the asking price to $15. The men simply laughed, turning their backs on the dark, dust-choked unit, eager to move on to the next locker. Margaret stepped forward. Her small, fragile frame parted the crowd of burly men. She walked straight up to the threshold of the dark unit, her worn shoes crunching softly against the gravel, ignoring the bitter cold that seeped through the soles. She did not look at the mocking faces of the dealers, nor did she flinch when a cold gust of wind hit her face. She reached into her coat pocket, feeling the crinkled edges of the only paper money she had left in the entire world. She pulled out the bills. $9, she stated firmly. Her voice was neither loud nor aggressive, but it carried a stoic, unyielding weight that instantly silenced the murmurs around her. The auctioneer stared in sheer disbelief. A few seconds later, the junk dealers erupted in cruel, mocking laughter, pointing their dirty fingers at the ragged old woman who was throwing away her cash on a literal pile of garbage. Margaret did not blink. She handed the auctioneer her $9, heaping only the 2 crumpled dollar bills and the copper 5-cent coin in her pocket. The man shoved a messy handwritten receipt into her hand, officially transferring the ownership over to the abandoned wasteland over to her. She was now the owner of a dark tomb. Ignoring the fading laughter of the scavengers, Margaret reached down and grabbed the cold iron handle of the metal door. She planted her feet firmly on the concrete, gathered every ounce of strength left in her freezing, starved body, and shoved the heavy door upward to let the morning sunlight flood into the darkest corners of the unit. And then, everything changed. The sunlight pierced the heavy dust, but it was not the sight of the room that made her breath catch. It was the smell. As the stagnant air finally circulated, a rich, intoxicating scent of raw linseed oil, melting wax beast, and deeply aged cherry wood washed over her weathered face, instantly sinking deep into her lungs and violently waking up a hauntingly familiar, agonizing intuition.
Margaret stepped over the rusting steel threshold. The suffocating, thick cloud of gray dust slowly settled against the cold concrete floor, revealing a space that was entirely devoid of the worthless garbage the auction crowd had so confidently mocked. She reached out with her heavily calloused hands, her dry fingers trembling ever so slightly in the biting 26-degree air, and grasped the frayed edge of a massive, heavy canvas tarp that covered the bulk of the room. She pulled it back with a fierce, sudden motion. The heavy fabric slipped away with a dull, heavy thud, exposing a meticulously organized, flawlessly maintained secret woodworking sanctuary that spanned the entire 10 by 10 foot enclosure. It was a master craftsman's hidden temple. Along the left wall stood a long, custom-built rack of carbon steel hand tools, their polished hickory handles lined up with a militant, almost obsessive precision. There were heavy smoothing planes, razor-sharp bevel-edged chisels in graduating sizes from 1/4 inch to 2 inches,
brass-backed tenon saws, cast-iron block planes, heavy wooden mallets, and rows of heavy steel clamps hanging neatly on oak pegs. Every single steel blade had been lovingly oiled, protected from the brutal Indiana humidity, and sharpened to a deadly mirror-like edge that caught the faint, pale morning sunlight piercing through the open doorway. She recognized the absolute discipline in this arrangement. In the very center of the room sat a massive 300-pound workbench built from solid, kiln-dried hard maple. It was 3 feet tall and 6 feet long, scarred by decades of intense, passionate labor, and marked with the deep, permanent gouges of a craftsman who poured his entire soul into the unyielding grain of the wood. But it was not the gleaming steel tools or the heavy maple workbench that made her heart ache with a fierce, quiet intensity. It was the breathtaking, raw skeletons of the furniture waiting patiently under the remaining sheets of dusty tarp. She pulled away the next dusty tarp. Beneath it sat a magnificent, 8-foot-long dining table, crafted from a single, continuous slab of dark American walnut that was easily 2 inches thick. The natural edge of the wood flowed like a frozen, dark river, rich and incredibly deep, polished to a flawless, glass-like finish that begged the human hand to touch it. Beside the heavy dining table sat a set of 6 matching rocking chairs, their curved runners perfectly balanced, their tall wooden backs arched with an elegant, sweeping grace that seemingly defied the laws of gravity. Margaret slowly fell to her knees. She ran her scarred, freezing fingertips along the back of the nearest chair, tracing the intricate, interlocking patterns of the exposed woodwork. They were hand-cut dovetail joints. They were cut with such terrifying, mathematical precision that the separate pieces of dark cherry wood fused together seamlessly, creating a structural bond of impossible strength without the use of a single iron nail, metal screw, or drop of cheap modern glue. It was absolute perfection. For 51 years, she had watched her quietly unassuming husband, Samuel, walk out to their small, uninsulated backyard garage in the late evenings. He would always smile gently at her, kiss her forehead, and tell her that he was just going out to tinker with some scrap pine boards, loudly claiming he was building simple birdhouses for the neighborhood children down the street. He had deliberately and systematically lied to her. He had actually spent an entire decade slipping away to this hidden, rusting facility on the desolate edge of town, standing entirely alone in the freezing winter drafts and the blistering summer heat, pouring his quiet, staggering genius into creating museum-quality masterpieces that the world was never allowed to see. He was a phantom master. The sheer weight of his silent, lifelong deception washed over her tired body, not as a vicious betrayal, but as a profound, earth-shattering mystery. Why would a man who lived such a humble, completely invisible life hide a collection of such staggering, undeniable value inside a forgotten storage locker? Margaret closed her eyes, absorbing the profound spiritual energy of the freezing room. She felt his lingering presence standing silently beside her, smelling the deeply familiar scent of his old shaving soap, inextricably mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of fresh sawdust. She absolutely refused to cry. She opened her eyes, her gaze hardening into a sharp, unbreakable resolve that mirrored the forged steel of his chisels. The agonizing pain of her morning eviction, the calculated cruelty of her greedy son-in-law, Vincent, and the pathetic, silent cowardice of her daughter, Evelyn, faded into the absolute background, completely eclipsed by the monumental legacy her husband had left in the shadows. This unit was not a tomb. This was a fortress built by a man who fundamentally understood that true resilience was born in total silence. She began to meticulously inspect every inch of the room. Margaret moved slowly but purposefully, her hands mapping the physical terrain of the wooden giants, measuring their immense worth not in meaningless dollars, but in the thousands of hours of back-breaking, solitary labor Samuel had secretly invested. She crawled under the heavy walnut table, inspecting the heavy wooden trestles. She checked the tension on the tall bandsaw tucked into the darkest corner of the unit. She examined a thick leather-bound ledger sitting on a dusty wooden shelf, filled with complex mathematical equations, precise measurements in inches and yards, and structural sketches drawn in Samuel's incredibly neat, precise handwriting. Everything was exactly where he had left it 4 years ago. She walked over to the massive maple workbench to steady her aching body, her legs finally trembling from the sheer, overwhelming physical exhaustion of the brutal morning. She leaned her weight against the heavy wooden edge, her breathing returning to a slow, measured rhythm. The wood was cold, incredibly dense, and perfectly solid beneath her touch. She slid her tired hand downward. The perfection of the wooden joints was an undeniable masterpiece, but when Margaret ran her calloused fingers under the heavy belly of the wooden workbench, her hand suddenly stopped dead against a flat, rigid surface that carried a completely wrong, freezing metallic temperature.
Margaret pulled her calloused hand back from the freezing metallic surface hidden deep beneath the heavy maple workbench. Her heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The rigid steel plane was completely encased behind a thick layer of solid oak paneling, permanently secured with heavy iron brackets and rusted screws that her bare, trembling fingers could never hope to pry apart. She ran her hands along the blind underside of the 300-pound table, mapping the physical boundaries of the hidden compartment, realizing instantly that brute force from a frail, 76-year-old woman would not break Samuel's masterful construction. She stepped back. Instead of collapsing onto the freezing concrete floor, instead of weeping in sheer frustration over the impenetrable mystery her deceased husband had left behind, Margaret simply rolled up the frayed wool sleeves of her winter coat. She looked around the 10 by 10-foot storage unit. The air temperature hovered at a brutal 28 degrees Fahrenheit, biting viciously at her exposed neck and turning every exhale into a thick plume of white vapor. She absolutely refused to surrender to the cold. In the darkest corner of the unit, leaning against the corrugated tin wall, she spotted an old, stiff-bristled broom with a cracked hickory handle. She walked over, her worn shoes scuffing against the gravel and dust, and gripped the dry wood with both hands. It was a simple, primitive tool, but to a woman who had spent 51 years maintaining order in a chaotic world, it was the only weapon that made sense. She began to sweep. She moved with a slow, deliberate, and fiercely stoic rhythm, dragging the heavy bristles across the stained concrete floor, pushing 10 years of accumulated decay, dead spiders, and thick gray dust toward the rusted threshold. The physical labor was intensely punishing. Her arthritic knees ached with a sharp, stabbing pain, and her lower back throbbed in protest with every single stroke of the broom, but her face remained entirely expressionless. She swept the perimeter first. She cleared the debris away from the heavy cast-iron base of a tall bandsaw, moving meticulously past the stacks of rough-sawn pine boards, and finally sweeping beneath the magnificent 8-foot-long walnut dining table. The dust rose into the stagnant air, coating her eyelashes and settling deeply into the heavy wool of her coat, but she did not cough or complain. She simply pushed the massive pile of dirt out into the freezing October morning, letting the bitter Indiana wind carry the ashes of the past away. The room was finally clear of the heavy debris. Margaret dropped the broom and moved toward a dusty wooden shelf lined with glass jars of rusted nails and old dried-up tins of finishing wax. She found a stack of clean, woven cotton rags tucked neatly inside a heavy cardboard box. She took one of the rags, walked back to the center of the unit, and began the agonizingly slow process of wiping down every single inch of her husband's hidden legacy.
She started with the master hand tools. She wiped the thick layer of grime off the heavy smoothing planes, the razor-sharp bevel-edged chisels, the brass-backed tenon saws, the delicate steel carving gouges, and the heavy wooden mallets with a relentless, punishing rhythm. She polished the brass fittings until they gleamed weakly in the pale sunlight, her hands moving instinctively, driven by a profound, silent respect for the man who had shaped them. The metal was brutally cold against her bare skin, rapidly draining the last remaining ounces of warmth from her tired veins, but her focus was absolute. She did not stop. Next, she moved to the unfinished furniture. She dragged the cotton rag across the magnificent, curving runners of the 6 cherry wood rocking chairs, pressing hard to remove the sticky, aged residue of forgotten sawdust. As she scrubbed the heavy, natural edge of the solid walnut dining table, the jagged edge of a dry, splintered wood grain caught the side of her right index finger, slicing deeply through her thin skin. A single drop of crimson blood welled up. It fell silently, landing directly onto the flawless, glassy surface of the dark walnut wood. Margaret stopped moving. She stared at the bright red stain against the deep brown timber, an incredibly stark, beautiful contrast of absolute sacrifice and enduring art. She calmly pressed her thumb over the bleeding cut, applying heavy pressure until the bleeding slowed, and then quietly wiped the blood off the table with her clean rag. There was no room for weakness here. 2 hours passed in pure, uninterrupted silence. Margaret was completely exhausted, her breathing heavy and ragged, her cracked knuckles bleeding in 3 different places, yet she continued to scrub the heavy maple workbench until the wood literally shone. She was entirely absorbed in her stoic labor, practically a ghost haunting a forgotten wooden sanctuary, completely unaware that a pair of quiet, observant eyes was watching her from the gravel driveway outside. Caleb Thorne stood perfectly still in the freezing wind. He was 68 years old, a towering, broad-shouldered town mechanic who spent his days entirely buried beneath the heavy steel frames of broken diesel trucks and rusted farm tractors. He wore a heavily insulated, grease-stained canvas jacket and thick leather work boots that crunched loudly on the gravel. He had been walking back to his own storage unit down the row, carrying a heavy metal toolbox, when the open door of unit number 42 caught his attention. He watched the old woman work. Caleb had lived in Whistle Creek his entire life, and he had seen desperate people scrambling through these abandoned lockers like starving animals, fighting violently over cheap electronics and pawn shop garbage. But he had never, in his 68 years, witnessed a fragile elderly woman in a worn coat meticulously cleaning a freezing, dust-choked room with such profound, undeniable dignity. He saw her bleeding hands. He saw the sheer, terrifying willpower radiating from her perfectly straight spine. He felt a deep, overwhelming wave of respect. Caleb did not walk over to offer her hollow pity, nor did he ask her a series of invasive, foolish questions about why she was shivering in a freezing metal box on a Saturday morning. He understood the sacred, unspoken language of hard labor. He turned around silently, walking his heavy boots back down the gravel path, and disappeared into the bitter wind without making a single sound. 20 minutes later, a heavy shadow fell across the concrete threshold. Margaret paused her scrubbing, turning her tired head toward the open doorway. Caleb stood there, blocking the pale sunlight, holding a massive, heavy-duty brass flashlight in his left hand. In his right hand, he held a steaming, large paper cup of black coffee and a thick slice of warm, buttered wheat bread wrapped neatly in a simple paper napkin. He stepped into the unit. "You were going to freeze to death before you finished the table," Caleb muttered gently. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, rough from years of breathing exhaust fumes, but heavily laced with a warm, unmistakable kindness. He did not ask for permission. He walked right past her, setting the steaming cup of coffee and the warm bread directly on the edge of the heavy maple workbench. He then placed the heavy brass flashlight beside the food, illuminating the darkest corners of the wooden sanctuary with a brilliant, blinding beam of white light.
Margaret stared at the steaming cup. She had not eaten a single bite of food since the previous afternoon, and the hollow, agonizing ache in her stomach suddenly roared to life at the rich, comforting smell of the dark roasted coffee. She looked up at Caleb's weathered, grease-stained face, seeing nothing but absolute sincerity and a quiet, unassuming grace. "Thank you," she replied calmly. She did not dive for the food like a starving animal. She wiped her dirty, bleeding hands on the edge of her coat, picked up the warm paper cup with both hands, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The scalding black liquid rushed down her throat, instantly sending a brilliant, violent shockwave of pure heat through her freezing, exhausted body. She took a small, polite bite of the soft bread, chewing silently, closing her eyes for just a fraction of a second to absorb the sheer, incredible warmth of human decency. Caleb did not stare at her while she ate. He politely turned his back, examining the magnificent dovetail joints on the cherry wood rocking chairs with a critical, appreciative eye. He ran his thick, grease-stained fingers over the seamless wood, letting out a low, deeply impressed whistle. "I have been working with my hands for 50 years, Caleb said quietly, his back still turned, "and I have never seen joints cut this perfectly, not once. Whoever built this was a terrifying genius." "My husband," Margaret said softly. "He was a master," Caleb replied firmly. Margaret finished the last drop of the coffee, setting the empty paper cup down on the table. The hot food had restored a vital, burning energy to her tired muscles. She looked at the heavy brass flashlight resting on the wood, and then she looked down at the massive maple workbench, her mind instantly returning to the freezing metallic surface hidden directly beneath it. "I need your help," she stated clearly. Caleb immediately turned around, stepping forward without a single moment of hesitation. Margaret pointed a scarred finger toward the heavy, shadow-drenched space beneath the 300-pound maple table. "There is a false bottom under the center block. It is secured with heavy iron brackets. I do not have the physical strength to pry the oak paneling loose." Caleb nodded once. He reached down and grabbed the heavy brass flashlight, clicking the beam to its maximum intensity. He dropped down heavily onto his knees, ignoring the freezing concrete, and slid his broad shoulders under the massive maple workbench. He shined the blinding white light directly upward, illuminating the thick, dust-covered oak panel that perfectly matched the underside of the table. "He hit it beautifully," Caleb muttered from under the table. "Countersunk screws, rusted over to look like old structural supports, but it's definitely a hollow cavity." He slid out from under the table and stood up. Caleb walked briskly out to his idling diesel truck parked 50 yards away. He returned less than a minute later carrying a massive 18-inch hardened steel crowbar and a heavy iron hammer. He did not ask what was inside the cavity, and he absolutely did not demand a share of whatever hidden treasure they were about to unearth. He simply wanted to help a dignified woman finish her relentless labor. He slid back beneath the workbench. Margaret stood back, watching closely as Caleb wedged the sharp wedge tip of the 18-inch steel crowbar directly into the hairline seam between the solid maple frame and the false oak panel. He gripped the heavy iron hammer in his right hand and struck the back of the crowbar with a deafening, violent crash that echoed sharply off the rusted tin walls of the storage unit. The wood groaned in heavy protest. He struck it again, swinging the hammer with immense, calculated power. The rusted iron bracket screamed as the metal began to bend, violently tearing the aged wood fibers apart. He dropped the hammer, gripping the heavy steel crowbar with both of his massive calloused hands, and pulled downward with every ounce of his back-breaking strength. A loud, explosive crack ripped through the air. The heavy oak panel violently detached from the underside of the workbench, dropping straight down onto the concrete floor with a heavy, dusty thud. Caleb quickly slid out of the way, pointing the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into the newly exposed dark cavity. Margaret stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat.
Resting securely inside the hollowed-out belly of the maple workbench was a massive, incredibly heavy fireproof steel safe. It was painted a dull industrial gray, totally untouched by the dust and decay of the outer room, and on the front of the heavy steel door sat a pristine, gleaming mechanical combination dial. She fell to her knees beside Caleb. Her bleeding, trembling fingers reached out, completely ignoring the freezing temperature of the solid steel, and gently grasped the cold metal dial. She did not need to guess the numbers, nor did she need to search the room for a hidden code. She simply closed her eyes and turned the heavy dial directly to the exact date of their freezing winter wedding in 1968. 3 turns to the left, 2 to the right, 1 to the left. The heavy internal tumblers fell perfectly into place, and as Margaret turned the handle, a heavy resounding click echoed through the quiet room, instantly unlocking a massive, incredibly invisible wave of energy that was completely capable of leveling everything in its path.
The heavy steel door swung outward on its perfectly balanced, oiled hinges, completely devoid of any rusted friction. A wave of perfectly preserved, dry air washed over Margaret's face, carrying the faint, crisp scent of aged parchment, old mint ink, and the undeniable essence of absolute security. Caleb Thorne held his ground, his massive boots planted firmly on the concrete floor, directing the blinding white beam of his heavy brass flashlight directly into the small, reinforced vault. Margaret did not scramble forward with the frantic, clawing greed of a desperate woman. She remained perfectly still. She leaned into the pale light, her breathing steady and measured, and carefully reached her calloused, bleeding hands into the dark interior. She extracted a thick, heavily sealed parchment envelope first, laying it gently onto the polished maple wood. Beneath the envelope rested a thick, beautifully bound leather notebook, its spine heavily creased from years of quiet use. And finally, sitting perfectly flush against the cold steel walls, lay neat, tightly banded stacks of crisp, immaculate $100 bills. It was a staggering fortune. Margaret stared at the meticulously organized rows of currency, her mind instantly flashing back to the mere $11 and the tarnished copper 5-cent coin sitting heavily in her frayed coat pocket. She slowly reached out, her fingers brushing the thick paper bands that wrapped the money, feeling the undeniable physical weight of her husband's secret labor. But she did not count the money. She reached for the parchment envelope. She slid her thumb under the heavy wax seal, breaking it with a sharp, dry snap, and pulled out a single sheet of beautifully textured, heavy stock paper. The dark ink was flawlessly preserved, the strokes mathematically precise, instantly resurrecting the quiet, steady voice of the man she had loved fiercely for 51 years. Margaret held the letter up to the blinding beam of the flashlight, completely ignoring the freezing 28-degree air biting at her exposed wrists. "My dearest Margaret," she read silently, a quiet warmth finally touching her eyes. The letter laid bare a 10-year masterpiece of staggering, devastating genius. Samuel wrote with absolute, unflinching clarity, confessing that he had known the deeply rotten, malignant truth about their 50-year-old son-in-law Vincent for a very long time. He had watched the younger man pace through their $600,000 home, his dark eyes constantly calculating the value of the antique rugs, the silver tea sets, and the very floorboards beneath his expensive leather shoes. Samuel saw the approaching storm. "I could not fight a venomous snake with a blunt sword," Samuel wrote, his ink pressing deeply into the paper with quiet, terrifying resolve. "I knew that the moment I drew my last breath, he would move to strip you of everything we built, and I knew our daughter would lack the spine to stop him.
so I built an invisible fortress in the absolute dark." He explained his monumental deception. For an entire decade, Samuel had secretly transported his master-level, handcrafted furniture pieces out of this freezing 10 by 10-foot storage unit in the dead of night. He had operated under a heavily protected, anonymous alias, quietly selling his exquisite dovetail-jointed tables and perfectly balanced rocking chairs to an elite network of private collectors located hundreds of miles away. Every single transaction was done in strict cash, completely bypassing the standard banking systems, and every single penny of profit had been meticulously funneled directly into this hidden steel vault. The cash totaled exactly $85,400. It was a staggering, absolute financial wall built meticulously by a quiet carpenter to ensure his beloved wife would never freeze on a lonely stone bench. Margaret lowered the letter slightly, her eyes resting on the tall stacks of $100 bills. The sheer magnitude of his solitary, back-breaking labor, the thousands of hours spent breathing sawdust in this freezing locker entirely alone just to shield her from a threat she never even saw coming, was overwhelming. She absolutely refused to weep. Instead, a profound, soaring dignity expanded in her chest, pulling her spine perfectly straight. She placed the letter gently onto the maple wood and reached for the heavy leather notebook. She opened the heavy cover, tracing her scarred fingertips over hundreds of pages of complex, deeply intricate blueprints, mathematical equations drawn to the exact fraction of an inch, and detailed structural sketches. Beside every single drawing was an official, heavily stamped patent number, legally registered entirely in her own name. He had made her an intellectual empire. Samuel had brilliantly copyrighted every single one of his revolutionary woodworking techniques and custom designs, transforming a simple hobby into an ironclad, incredibly lucrative stream of perpetual royalties. But the massive piles of cash and the exclusive design notebook were merely the defensive walls of his fortress. The true weapon, the absolute, undeniable blade he had forged to sever Vincent's manipulative grip, was waiting at the very bottom of the safe. Margaret reached inside one last time. She pulled out a thick, watermarked legal document, unfolding it carefully under the bright, steady beam of Caleb's heavy brass flashlight. It was a pristine, officially notarized joint tenancy deed for their sprawling two-story house. The heavy paper bore the raised, undeniable seal of the county clerk, dated legally and firmly a full year before Samuel's tragic passing. The legal language was absolutely unbreakable. The document explicitly and unconditionally stated that upon his death, the sole uncontested ownership of the property would automatically transfer directly to Margaret Holloway. This specific legal maneuver completely bypassed the standard probate courts, instantly rendering any subsequent wills, any late-stage property transfers, and any shady corporate sales entirely null and void. Vincent's eviction paper was a complete, pathetic forgery. The document Vincent had aggressively thrown onto her antique coffee table just hours ago, the piece of paper he had used to confidently throw her out into the freezing October morning, was nothing but a fake, legally worthless piece of trash. Samuel had perfectly anticipated the exact nature of the betrayal, outsmarting a corrupt, manipulative corporate manager by simply executing a flawless, ironclad legal strike in total silence. Margaret stared at the county seal. She did not scream out in victorious joy, nor did she collapse into a trembling fit of relief. She simply folded the heavy document with absolute surgical precision, sliding it safely into the inner pocket of her worn wool coat, right next to her $11 and the sacred copper 5-cent coin. She was no longer a discarded, starving widow wandering the freezing streets of Whistle Creek. She was an absolute titan. Caleb Thorne remained perfectly silent, holding the flashlight steady, deeply humbled by the monumental revelation that had just unfolded in the rusted unit. He did not ask invasive questions or offer unnecessary congratulations. He simply watched the elderly woman stand up straight, her face set in unbreakable stone, as she looked out toward the gravel driveway. "I need to find a telephone," Margaret stated evenly, her voice carrying a terrifying calm. The $85,400 in cash was an incredible lifeline for a discarded woman, but the undeniable legal weight of that stamped property deed and the exclusive design notebook were the true, terrifying weapons, quietly waiting to completely obliterate the fragile, fraudulent empire of the Traitors.
Margaret did not return to the freezing stone bench outside the municipal post office. She walked directly down the cracked sidewalks of Main Street, pushing through the heavy glass doors of the oldest law firm in Whistle Creek. Arthur Harrison sat behind a massive oak desk, a perfectly pressed suit hanging off his thin frame. He was 70 years old, a fiercely principled, terrifyingly sharp attorney who had known Samuel and Margaret for decades. Margaret sat quietly in the leather chair opposite him, completely ignoring her bleeding knuckles, her aching joints, and her dust-covered wool coat. She did not waste his time with weeping tears, and she did not ask for his pity. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out the fraudulent eviction notice Vincent had handed her that morning, and laid it smoothly onto the desk next to the heavy, watermarked joint tenancy deed she had pulled from the steel safe. Harrison adjusted his glasses. He read the documents in absolute silence, his jaw tightening with every passing second as the monumental, sickening scale of the betrayal became incredibly clear. He picked up his heavy rotary telephone, completely bypassing his secretary, and dialed 2 very specific numbers, demanding their immediate presence at the desolate edge of town. Within the hour, a renowned forensic document examiner and a high-end antique appraiser arrived at the rusted threshold of storage unit number 42. They stepped into the freezing, dust-filled room with a quiet, reverent awe. They worked in absolute silence. The appraiser, a meticulous man with white cotton gloves and a heavy magnifying loupe, examined the sweeping runners of the cherry wood rocking chairs, the flawless dovetail joints of the massive maple workbench, and the raw, unbroken edge of the solid walnut dining table. He carefully reviewed the thick leather notebook, reading the complex mathematical equations and the officially stamped patent numbers. Across the freezing room, the forensic examiner set up a portable ultraviolet light, laying Vincent's forged transfer document directly beside a stack of Samuel's verified, handwritten letters. He measured the ink density, the heavy pen pressure, the paper indentations, and the erratic, nervous micro-tremors hidden deep inside the fake signature. The verdict was absolute. The raw furniture collection, combined with the immense intellectual property of these design patents, commands a baseline valuation of exactly $1,200,000, the appraiser stated quietly, his voice trembling slightly in the 28-degree air. Margaret did not flinch. The forensic examiner stepped back from the blinding ultraviolet light, his face set in a grim, unforgiving line. The signature on the eviction notice is a 100% absolute forgery, executed with incredibly malicious intent, he confirmed firmly. This is textbook premeditated fraud, and it constitutes a direct, irrefutable felony charge of elder abuse. Margaret stood perfectly still in the center of the wooden sanctuary.
Just hours ago, she had been a discarded, completely broken widow, cast out into the freezing October wind with exactly $11 and a tarnished copper 5-cent coin to her name. Now, standing entirely silent amidst the heavy scent of aged cherry wood and raw linseed oil, she was a multi-millionaire holding absolute, terrifying legal power. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply buttoned her frayed wool coat, looking at the silent steel tools, feeling the immense protective warmth of her husband's eternal love wrapping completely around her fragile shoulders. She was untouchable. Or so she thought. In a small, suffocating town like Whistle Creek, secrets of this monumental magnitude never stayed buried for long. A local scavenger from the morning auction had recognized the antique Appraiser's luxury vehicle parked outside the rusted chain-link gates, and within 2 short hours, a frantic, highly exaggerated rumor of a massive $1-million treasure hidden in an abandoned storage locker had swept violently through the local diners, the barber shops, and the hardware stores. Vincent Croft heard the whisper. Sitting comfortably in his newly stolen $600,000 house, the greedy, calculating son-in-law felt a cold, terrifying spike of panic pierce his chest as he realized exactly which storage unit the townsfolk were talking about. He violently slammed his coffee cup onto the antique table, grabbing his car keys and a freshly drafted, utterly despicable legal document, racing his luxury vehicle straight toward the edge of town to forcefully seize the massive fortune with one final ruthless trick before the old woman could secure it.
The heavy tires of a luxury black sedan violently tore through the loose gravel, kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust outside the rusted chain-link fence of the storage lot. Vincent Croft slammed the transmission into park. He shoved the heavy car door open, stepping out into the biting 30-degree Fahrenheit afternoon wind with his expensive wool coat flapping wildly around his legs. Behind him, his wife Evelyn scrambled out of the passenger seat, her face utterly pale, her hands trembling fiercely as she clutched her expensive leather purse. A third person emerged from the back seat, a slick, aggressive corporate attorney carrying a thick leather briefcase. They marched toward unit number 42 like a pack of starving wolves. Vincent completely dropped his carefully manufactured mask of polite, civilized mourning, his dark eyes burning with a raw, ugly desperation to seize the unbelievable wealth he had just heard about through town whispers. He stopped directly at the metal threshold of the open unit, his heavy breathing creating thick plumes of white vapor in the freezing air. He peered into the dimly lit, dust-choked room. Margaret was waiting for him. She sat perfectly still on a beautifully polished, solid walnut rocking chair, her frail 76-year-old frame completely enveloped in the quiet, undeniable power of her husband's hidden sanctuary. She did not stand up, she did not flinch, she did not yell, and she absolutely did not cower before the man who had thrown her onto the street with exactly $11 in her pocket just 8 hours ago. Vincent sneered viciously. "You really thought you could hide this from me?" Vincent spat furiously, his voice echoing loudly off the corrugated tin walls. He aggressively snatched a thick stack of legal papers from his lawyer, waving them wildly in the air, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. He loudly declared that the $1,200,000 in antique furniture, the $85,400 in cash, and the exclusive design patents were completely, entirely his property. He claimed that Samuel had built them on his land, using his resources, and he would absolutely not let a senile, broken old woman steal his massive fortune. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Margaret. "I am filing this petition with the county court tomorrow morning,"
Vincent threatened maliciously, slapping the heavy documents against his palm. "I am declaring you completely incompetent, suffering from severe advanced dementia, and entirely incapable of managing your own physical or financial affairs. I will become your permanent legal guardian. I will take every single penny in this room. I will sell the $600,000 house, and I will lock you away in a psychiatric ward where you belong." Margaret looked at him. She simply rested her calloused, bleeding hands on the perfectly smooth, hand-carved armrests of the walnut chair, her face a terrifying mask of absolute, unyielding stone. She listened to the pathetic barking of a man who built his entire life on the fragile foundation of lies, manipulation, and the silent suffering of others. She did not say a single word. Instead, a tall, imposing shadow stepped out from the darkest corner of the 10 by 10 foot storage unit. Arthur Harrison, the fiercely principled 70-year-old attorney, walked slowly into the pale afternoon sunlight. He was not alone. Behind him, the heavy, measured footsteps of the county sheriff crunched loudly against the concrete floor, his polished brass badge gleaming brightly against his dark uniform. Vincent froze completely. The color drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray as the heavy legal petition slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered uselessly across the dirty floor. Harrison adjusted his glasses, completely ignoring the aggressive corporate attorney standing uselessly by the doorway, and pulled the pristine, heavily notarized joint tenancy deed from his briefcase. "Vincent Croft," Harrison stated firmly, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority, "you are standing in the presence of the sole, uncontested legal owner of the $600,000 estate and the absolute proprietor of this $1,200,000 collection." Harrison did not stop there. He pulled out the official, heavily stamped forensic document report, holding it directly to Vincent's terrified eyes. He read the devastating conclusion aloud, his voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. He detailed the undeniable proof of the forged signature on the eviction notice, the exact measurements of the ink density, and the malicious, premeditated intent to strip an elderly widow of her rightful home. The trap violently snapped shut. "You are absolutely finished," Harrison whispered coldly. The county sheriff stepped forward, his heavy leather boots closing the distance in 3 quick strides. He grabbed Vincent by his expensive wool shoulder, violently spinning him around and slamming him forcefully against the rusted metal doorframe of the unit. The cold steel of the handcuffs gleamed in the pale sunlight, a stark, unforgiving contrast to the warm, deeply loved cherry wood of the furniture surrounding them. The brutal, heavy sound of thick steel, ratcheting tightly around Vincent's wrists, echoed sharply across the desolate storage lot. He was officially under arrest. The sheriff loudly read the charges, his voice cutting through the freezing October wind with absolute clarity. Vincent was being arrested for felony forgery, extreme elder abuse, and massive premeditated fraud. Vincent tried to stammer a pathetic, incoherent defense, claiming it was all a simple misunderstanding, but his words died instantly in his dry throat. The polished, arrogant man who had proudly thrown a 76-year-old woman out into the freezing cold just hours ago was now completely broken, his knees buckling, his breathing shallow and rapid, as the sheer, terrifying reality of a long, brutal prison sentence crashed down upon him. Evelyn completely collapsed. She fell onto the dirty, oil-stained gravel, her expensive designer purse spilling its contents across the stones. She realized in a blinding, agonizing flash that her entire life was completely destroyed. Her marriage was over, her stolen wealth was entirely evaporated, and her husband was going to a federal penitentiary. She crawled on her knees toward the metal threshold, tears streaming rapidly down her face, her manicured hands reaching desperately toward the mother she had so easily abandoned. "Please, Mom, please help me," Evelyn sobbed uncontrollably. Margaret remained seated. She looked down at the weeping, broken 78-year-old woman growling in the dirt. She felt the heavy weight of the copper 5-cent coin resting in her frayed coat pocket, remembering the agonizing, freezing night she had spent entirely alone on a stone bench, fully prepared to quietly starve to death while her daughter slept warmly in a stolen bed. Margaret did not raise her voice, but her words carried the absolute devastating weight of a falling mountain. "Those who throw others away do not possess the right to appraise their value," Margaret stated coldly. She turned her face away. The sheriff forcefully dragged Vincent away from the unit, shoving the pale, trembling, ruined man into the back of a heavily armored police cruiser. Evelyn was left sobbing hysterically in the gravel, completely ignored by the officers, utterly shattered by the devastating, unstoppable force of absolute karma. The heavy police tires spun, throwing dirt into the cold air as they drove away, taking the pathetic, arrogant traitors directly into the humiliating, unforgiving darkness they had built for themselves. The air was finally clean. The toxic, suffocating presence of the traitors was entirely gone, completely banished from her sight, returning a profound, sweeping peace to the pale autumn afternoon, where Margaret slowly stood up from the walnut chair, entirely prepared to use this massive, hard-earned legacy to execute one final, profoundly beautiful mission.
A year passed, sweeping away the bitter frost of that brutal October morning and replacing it with the golden, radiant warmth of a late summer afternoon in Whistle Creek, Indiana. Margaret was 77. She had successfully reclaimed absolute, legally binding ownership of her sprawling $600,000 estate, easily solidifying her massive fortune with the unending stream of patent royalties. But she fundamentally refused to surrender to a life of hollow, meaningless luxury. She did not purchase expensive vehicles, she did not hire a staff of polished housekeepers, and she absolutely did not replace the hand-laid oak floorboards that her husband had meticulously crafted half a century ago. She built a sanctuary. Using the $85,400 in cash pulled directly from the rusted darkness of Unit 42, she had completely transformed the massive detached garage and the sprawling 2-acre backyard into the Samuel Holloway Woodworking Academy. It was a completely free, rigorously disciplined vocational school designed exclusively for the lost, struggling, and discarded teenagers of the rural town, offering them a heavily structured path out of poverty through the sheer, undeniable mastery of carbon steel and solid wood. The air smelled incredibly alive. Sitting on the wide wooden porch of her home, Margaret rested peacefully in the beautifully balanced cherry-wood rocking chair that Samuel had secretly built for her in his silent exile. The ambient temperature hovered at a perfect 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark, beautiful contrast to the freezing, bone-chilling cold that had once threatened to consume her very existence. The golden sunlight filtered softly through the rustling leaves of the towering maple trees, casting long, peaceful shadows across the freshly cut green grass of the yard. From inside the open doors of the massive academy, the steady, rhythmic sounds of heavy handsaws cutting through thick pine, the quiet scraping of cast-iron smoothing planes, and the focused murmurs of 15 young apprentices drifted beautifully into the evening breeze. They were building foundations. Caleb Thorne stood proudly inside the shop, having retired from his grease-stained mechanic garage to become the lead instructor of the academy. "Hold the chisel perfectly straight," Caleb instructed gently, his deep voice carrying clearly across the yard.
he patiently guided a troubled 17-year-old boy through the incredibly precise, unforgiving mathematics of a hand-cut dovetail joint, ensuring the carbon steel blade struck the wood with absolute perfection. The heavy steel hand tools that once sat silently in a freezing, abandoned tomb were now fiercely, undeniably alive, passing their ancient, enduring wisdom into the trembling, eager hands of a completely new generation. Margaret closed her tired eyes. She slid her heavily calloused, permanently scarred hand deep into the warm pocket of her simple cotton cardigan, her fingers brushing past the soft fabric until they found the incredibly familiar, comforting shape of a small metal disc. She gently rubbed the smooth, tarnished edges of the copper 5-cent coin, profoundly anchored by the unbroken, silent promise it represented from that freezing winter date in 1968. Her husband was truly immortal. She had successfully brought life, dignity, and purpose back into a space that was meant to be stolen, creating an eternal monument of love that no corrupt lawyer or greedy relative could ever tear down. She rocked back and forth, entirely at peace. From the absolute, crushing despair of holding exactly $11 to the terrifying, calculated cruelty of her own blood relatives, this quiet, dignified woman had permanently carved an undeniable, towering truth into the very fabric of the earth. Vicious people can conspire to violently strip away your material wealth. They can forge legal documents to steal your physical home, and they can cast you out into the freezing winter wind without a second thought. But they can never, ever steal the monumental, quiet strength of a patient soul willing to rebuild an entire universe from the scattered ashes.